Well, I want to thank you very much for that kind introduction, Ernst. I have had several trips here, and I've always learned a great deal. And I think, as was said earlier tonight, the structure of learning here in the Department of Economics has really been outstanding in the sense of contributing not just to the established field of economics, but to broadening the study of economics to include neuroeconomics, to include aspects of behavioral economics, and to provide a much deeper understanding about the way humans make decisions and the way societies function. So I'm really honored to be able to be back here, and I'm sure I will learn. I've already learned a great deal. I'm sure I'll learn more. And tonight I will try to educate you a little bit about what I've learned about education and inequality, and in a particular study, as Ernst mentioned, with the study of comparing the US and Denmark. And I would point out that this is with a joint work with Rasmus Lunderso, who's my co-author. He's at the Rockwell Foundation in Copenhagen. So I want to talk to you about some surprising results, and let me just give you the panoramic view of as Ernst already said, the Scandinavian welfare state is regarded as the paradigm for promoting equality and social mobility. In the United States, the appeal to Denmark as a Garden of Eden for social policy has become very common among many politicians of all order, especially more liberal democratic politicians. But the question I had as an economist living in America, and given the kind of appeal that I heard, was what are the sources of its success? And what do I mean by its success? Well, what I mean is this graph that has gone around the world. It was coined originally by, the name is called the Gatsby curve, named by Alan Kruger, the late Alan Kruger. But the curve itself is a curve that relates two different concepts and suggests some very important policy implications that we might want to consider. So if you look at the equation on the top, it says, what's the income of a child, say lifetime income, and that's one thing I'll tell you about at the end of the talk if I ever get there. But relate that to the income of the child to the income of the parent. There are many different ways to define both of those concepts, but I'm talking about a full family income and all the resources. It's not just earnings, but transfer income and the like. And this coefficient you see up there, it's called IGE, is actually something that relates how strongly dependent the outcome of the child, measured in terms of income, is related to the income of the parent. I'll show you later a relationship in Denmark and the US where instead of income, I just look directly at education. But there are some very important features of this graph, two features which are important. So beta, this measure beta, called the IGE, intergenerational elasticity, is a measure of dependence. If beta is 0, you might think of this as a society in which the origin of a child plays no role for later outcomes. If beta is very high, then you get very strong dependence. And so beta is plotted on the y-axis here in this graph. It's a measure of mobility. But on the x-axis, you also will see plot of inequality in income. And this is family income inequality, inclusive of tax and transfers, and looking at this in a cross-section way, taken from very commonly available OECD and other reports around the world. And you'll see a feature there. I've circled two groups of countries. If you look at the Scandinavian countries, including Denmark, the study of today, you'll see that there are two things about Denmark. Beta is low, and the income inequality is also low. If you look at other countries, for example, my own, the United States, it's much higher. And if you go down to Latin America, you can see much higher inequality at a point in time, measured by a Gini coefficient, measure of inequality, and also much lower social mobility. So the origin of the person, the family origin, plays a huge role in determining what the lifetime outcomes will be. So this is a fascinating relationship, and you can see that this curve beta is positively related to the degree of income inequality. And this raises a series of questions. Ernst already talked about causality, but causality is a central theme in much of the work, not only in science, but of course in economics and other social sciences. And the question is, how do we interpret this relationship? Many people, including Alan Kruger, who coined this term, Gatsby, after the novel The Great Gatsby, really wanted to say those societies where there was greater income inequality were also ones where there was no mobility. And so that you're at the high end of that curve, way out there. And so beta was very high and income inequality was high. So he wanted to establish a causal link between income inequality and social mobility. But it turns out there's another interpretation, and this is something that economists, we're always cursed by saying, on the one hand there's this, on the one hand there's that. But there is a second interpretation, and that is that the family transmission mechanism itself is what's producing the inequality. And then in fact, if you know some mathematics, you could show that the variance, the cross-section inequality, could be strongly dependent on the value of beta. The higher beta, the bigger the Gini coefficient, in fact. So if you thought of it as saying family influence plays a big role, through other mechanisms other than just pure income transfer, that could also give rise to this. So the question is, what explains this? Why are these countries doing so well in terms of inequality in income and also social mobility of children? So I went to Denmark, partly because Denmark came to me. I had a graduate student who came from Aarhus University, who's now my co-author, who was taking a class of mine, and I was pointing out this Korak curve, the relationship I just gave you, and happened to have access to the Danish data. All Danes do have access to the census data if they're researchers. And he was able to produce some very startling statistics right after the class gave them to me. And this paper really builds on that kind of discussion. It's the kind of discussion that goes on here at the university and goes on at many top universities around the world, but Zurich is certainly one of those universities. So Denmark, of course, is very much tied to the notion, the Danish welfare state is tied to the notion of reducing inequality and promoting social mobility. And I just showed you that the inequality is quite low and the social mobility is high. But what I want to try to explain today is that it's not what I thought it was, and it's not what a lot of Americans think it was that's giving rise to this. Denmark offers a very high level of social services, much higher than the United States. There's equality in services offered. It's mandated, and this is a very important part of my story, that equality in services offered is mandated, but the real question is not just what the services are in terms of being offered, but what services are actually taken. Universal health care in Denmark is something that many people refer to and been imitated. Teachers are paid the same everywhere, unlike in the United States. College is free, and of course, Denmark has much greater social cohesion. So what I want to claim today is that the reduced inequality and greater intergenerational mobility that I'm talking about and showed you in that graph is not due to the superior production of child human capital, the topic that Ernst was talking about and we'll hear more of later tonight. Despite the fact that its generous child leave policy and educational policies are very, very much different from the United States. And that was actually my thinking about why this was true, why this relationship held that I just showed you. And so what I want to argue is that there are substantial skill and education gaps across families by background. So the advantages from Denmark's universal system of access are still captured more by the affluent and those in the know compared to those who don't know. And so family influence creeps back even into the most tightly regulated welfare state. So what I want to talk about today in the brief time I have is I want to talk about the strong evidence of sorting of families by parental income. And I want to talk about something called the power of place. Many people have noticed that people born into one area are more likely to succeed than people born into another area. But what I want to think is missing in the current discussion, and is something that is really central to the work here in Zurich, and I think the work in understanding child development, is the powerful role of family and family choices. And that the kind of policies that we have out in the world today are much less effective because we don't fully account for the role of families. And so I'm going to show you evidence on neighborhood effects and the timing of moves to those neighborhoods. But what I also want to show you is that much of the location of families in neighborhoods is, not surprisingly, a consequence of family choice. And what's interesting is that you're going to find patterns of similarity in Denmark compared to that of US, despite all of these better features of the welfare state. And I'm going to argue that sorting plays a major role. And let me get to the evidence. So my argument is very simple. When you look at politics today, and maybe some of you heard the debate last night on the American presidential election, and exactly this kind of argument showed up, that a central premise is equality of access. That's mandated by law in Denmark. And so I want to argue that equality in the law does not imply equality in the use of services. And what was come to be called the Matthew effect, it's named after a chapter in the verse in the New Testament, the book of Matthew, and it's basically paraphrased by saying, to those who have, more is given, plays a powerful role. And so what happens then is, even when we have equal provision, and even when we've mandated equality in terms of dollar of goods provided, we essentially find substantial role for the family in picking different uses, making better use of those resources. And so this is really an important notion about the way we think of policy. One way to think about policy, the Max Weber way, I think, is to provide bureaucratic services that give access to everyone equally. But what we've come to realize is that targeted programs, and programs that recognize this differential ability of families, of more affluent and more educated families, to take advantage of the social environment, plays a huge role and needs to be recognized more explicitly in social policy. And I'll give you an example from Denmark, where Carlson and my co-author Landerso have shown how universal moved from a targeted policy that was originally targeted towards disadvantaged rural children living in the main peninsula of Denmark, actually to a universal policy, increased that beta, increased the dependence between the parent and the child. And it did so precisely because of this mechanism of family influence, which we frequently ignore. So what I want to argue is that, like many countries in the West, blessedly, we have a free housing market. There's a lot of sorting that goes on. And one thing that's going on in the world is this notion of sorting and social networks being produced, more sorting going on, what sociologists and economists call homophily, namely likes attract each other, more educated mothers marrying more educated fathers, and less educated people sorting in neighborhoods. These sorting mechanism plays a very powerful role in explaining these differences. And the one thing I want to get to is this notion of neighborhood choice. Neighborhood choice plays a very powerful role, but it's not the sense that it's a cause of some neighborhood. It's not a property of the soil or the air pollution, or for that matter, a lot of the amenities. When parents are purposely sorting at the neighborhoods, it launches these peer effects that Ernst was talking about. It launches create an environment of learning, imitation, and fostering of children that varies greatly by the affluence of the parents who sort in those neighborhoods. So I'm going to use very unusual data. The nice thing about the Danish data is that we can follow people over their lifetimes. It's a register system, so we can actually find out exactly how much they weighed at birth and exactly when they died and of what they died. And we can follow them to the health records. We can follow them to their income. We know their jobs. We know their schools. We know their neighborhoods. We know their peers. And we know the people they went to school with. So it's a very rich data set, and we're exploiting it in a series of studies. And we're trying to look at inequality over the life cycle. So let me just try to show you some features. Here's one thing that startled me. If you look at the US, there's a strong, what's called a gradient curve, a slope, between ability and high school completion, secondary school completion. And if you look at it, you can see these different 4 graphs on the left side of your facing you. You can see in the US that as you move up across the ability quartiles, and it's related to IQ, it's not fully IQ, but it's related to cognitive capabilities, that as we move up, we see very strong relationships. But within each ability cluster, what we also see, so more able people are graduating high school, very simple. But if you look within ability groups, those from more affluent families are the ones more likely to graduate than those from the less affluent families. So this is a relationship that's been well studied, caused a lot of concern and a lot of study in the US. Lance Lochner at the University of Western Ontario has investigated this in much greater detail. But if you look at Denmark, you get a very similar pattern. Family background's playing a similar role. And these are similar measures. So it's not like I'm just creating apples and orange comparisons. These are really very similar comparisons. And what you also can see is if you look at the cognitive test scores by parents' income rank in the overall distribution, the US and Denmark are very similar, which came as a surprise to this American anyway. So you ask, what's going on here? Why are we getting this kind of pattern? And what we also found is there are substantial gaps. Remember, this is a society in which you have a lot of inequality reduced of a formal sense. Public provision is at a much higher level. And in fact, when we think about inequality, one thing that's true is a lot of the statistics that we measure inequality don't really capture the full benefits of public provision. Things like health, roads, police, defense, and so forth and so on. But if you just look at the measures that we do have, and you look, for example, at the gap by mother's education in the US, we can see that the more educated, college-educated mothers have children of a higher birth weight. And if you look at the bottom, you see the less educated, those who dropped out of high school, have lower birth weight kids. And it goes over the whole life cycle. If you look at measures of sociability, language, crime, years of schooling, wage earnings, and whether or not you're even alive at age 60. Those gradients those are American gradients, and that's what gives rise to such concerns about inequality in the United States. We'll ask, what's going on in Denmark? Well, you're getting gaps that are there, substantial gaps, and that's very surprising. And so we ask, well, why are these gaps? And they are very comparable, these gaps. I don't have time to go through measurements. I'm happy to send anybody these slides if they want to see them on their own. But you can take my word for it that they are very comparable. And again, we see very sharp gradients in terms of years in the labor force and whether or not you're alive. So that's the question. Why did these gaps arise? And what I want to argue is that this is not based on skills. The reason why, the greater social mobility, it's not because of the education and training policies. It has much more to do with the way the society is organized and the way that policy is being administered. Really, what's going on is very obvious, one that's taught in public finance courses and economics and would appeal immediately to your common sense, that has nothing to do with skills. It has much more to do with tax and transfers. The Danish tax rate's much higher, the transfer policy is more generous, and that's the reason why you're getting a leveling going on. But it has nothing to do with the fact that Danish children are more educated and more skilled and many things that you might think would result from this educational system. So this is really an important part of the story, this sorting that's going on. So let me just give you an idea. This is a graph comparing the US schooling expenditure but with the Danish schooling expenditure. The dashed line is a distribution of school expenditures. Teacher salaries are mandated to be equal, except for what you might call combat pay, or pay doing particularly difficult work in, say, in a difficult area of Jutland or with disadvantaged children. So it's a very concentrated. If you look at the other distribution, the one that's not dotted, the one that's a solid line, there's huge variation in American education. And that's been very well documented, and it's a source of major concern. Now, we've had a lot of interest in education of neighborhoods. So I'm going to tell you there's a version of the Gatsby curve you can do for neighborhoods. The rank in a neighborhood and the rank of income in a neighborhood. That's very strong relationship as well. And this is an argument from Chetty, who's a scholar at Harvard University. He's worked a lot on this question of neighborhood effects. And the darker neighborhoods, the darker counties in the United States are the ones where the rank of the child is the lowest and the outcome, this dependence between the parent's rank and the child's rank is the highest. So not surprisingly, in the US South and in some of the inner cities in America, that's extremely dependent. And then it varies. The lighter the score, the lighter the coloration, the less the dependence. But on the other hand, if you go to Denmark, where we have much more equal policy, it's not that certainly the US is worse. The dependence in certain counties is worse than anything in Denmark. But Denmark has a lot of variability, and it's equal in that regard. So the question is, what accounts for this? One widely accepted interpretation is location. And there's been a sense of policy saying we should relocate people, move people from one neighborhood to another, if not by force, but by choice, to relocate people across neighborhoods. That's the so-called power of place. There's another interpretation, which I hinted at earlier, which is how parents will influence child outcomes, and parents will also pick the location of the place. And even yet, and what I would argue is the third item, the one on the bottom of this figure, which talks about parental traits leading to sorting and powerful peer effects. So it's a combination. But the role of the family has to be carefully constructed. So what is location? School quality, peers, amenities? Well, we can look at this. And so this is an example of an analysis which has been very influential. The New York Times is promoting this almost, I would say monthly these days. It used to be daily, but very common. And the notion here is very simple. I don't want to get into the details, but the idea is that the longer a child, say of a disadvantaged nature, lives in a good, say born into poverty or something, and then lives in a good neighborhood, the longer the person lives in the neighborhood, the more likely they are to be upwardly mobile. Oops, getting ahead of myself, literally. I didn't do anything. But anyway, what we also can see is something very similar in Denmark. Very similar relationship, that the origin, the place of origin matters a great deal. But oops, wait a minute. How come this is acting on its own? This is taking a mind of its own. ChatGPT took over. I'm now in trouble. I hope not. Okay, well anyway, that's the nature of it. So anyway, there's a lot of variability, and let me put it that way, that there really is a lot of sorting going on. So I won't get into all the details, but I'll give you a sense of what is called income segregation patterns in the US. And this is a measure, the details needn't worry you so much. It's an entropy-based measure of how people are sorting, how similar they are. And the higher the curve, the more similarity they are, and the more similarity there is at the upper tail of the income distribution and the lower tail. And there's been a trend over the last 50 years towards increasing this sorting pattern in the United States. We've become much more segregated and association by income. If you look at Denmark, you get a very similar pattern. Again, you're finding peers, parents, neighborhoods. You're finding the characteristics of these neighborhoods populated by more and more similar, either very affluent or rather poor people as well. And so there's a very, very strong sorting. And I will just, without getting into too much detail here, point out there's something very odd going on. Remember, teachers' wages are the same everywhere, allegedly, and they are. You can look at the salaries. I can look at the salaries. I know exactly what the salaries are of teachers in Denmark. But what you find, nonetheless, is that if you look at the teacher quality, and you can measure the quality because you know what their grades were, their own grades in college, and you know a lot of measures of the teacher quality from their own transcripts and so forth, you can see a pattern of sorting, that black line. And what's going on? Well, teachers are paid all the same, but what's another form of compensation for a teacher? It's having good students. Your life is much simpler. If you're in a school with very disadvantaged and very unruly children, you're in trouble. And so this is one way that a non-price mechanism that's at work in terms of explaining sorting. So you're getting a lot of sorting going on. But there's a lot of choice, and this is very crucial, going back to that picture I showed you a minute ago about how, there was this neighborhood effects were there. The one thing we know, all of you who are parents would know, and people who've bought houses and thought about their children's welfare, know that the decision to move to a neighborhood is usually made in advance of the child's birth, or certainly in recognition of having a good environment for a child. It's no different in the US than it is in Denmark. And all these graphs do is say that, so I won't bother you with. But it is the case that if you look at more educated mothers, you can see essentially very strong effects. But that's all very interesting. Let me give you something that's even more. I'll just have to skip over a lot of these slides, but I'll give you something else. So this is the Chetty evidence I talked about earlier. The longer you live in an affluent neighborhood, the higher the score of the child in terms of outcomes in the society. That's what this graph says. However, there are other measures of child outcomes, and one would be birth weight. So you ask, well, wait a minute. It turns out that those children who are living in those more affluent neighborhoods, who are allegedly getting this benefit from the exposure to the more affluent neighborhoods, have higher birth weights and higher birth lengths, suggesting a very different interpretation of causality. What went into that sorting was essentially the sorting caused by the parental choice. The parents engaged in actively looking into the lives of their children, not the notion of the neighborhood environment per se. So what I would argue is that these are very important findings. And one last piece of evidence in this regard goes back to Denmark in the schooling policies that were targeted during different periods of time. I don't know if you can see the graph that well. It should be better legend. But the top figure that's going up and then going down, you can see the US estimate and then the Danish estimate. But the fact is, what this is saying, and I'll just say verbally instead of going through explaining this graph, that what you're finding is that the phenomenon is that in the targeted systems, targeting disadvantaged children, there was a lot of social mobility. When it became public and became universal access, it turns out that parents of children who are more affluent within any level of eligibility turn out to be able to game the system better. So one of the findings from recent studies in the United States by Chris Walters and others is basically that in access to charter schools and to other kinds of preschools that are high quality, the children who benefit the most are the ones who are the poorest, have the most disadvantage. But in any level of eligibility and any level of income, these children who are enrolled in the systems are the most advantaged. So however we define disadvantaged, those at the top are the ones getting in. So there's a relatively important role, a very important role, for the family in essentially using the resources of this allegedly equal system. So I think one has to recognize that these public expenditure, it's not just a question of increasing and making things available in a general way. We have to really understand that the structure is very important. So I would argue that we know that targeting disadvantage is a large body of literature. I don't really have time to talk about it, but targeting is very, very important. And that runs contrary to one of the ethos of the welfare state. And I think that has to be really carefully examined going forward. And so I really don't have time to go through this, but I will make one statement about intergenerational transmission of well-being. The way that this graph that I gave you at the beginning was constructed, we looked at income measures that were essentially looking at things like consumption today, transfers today, income today, and relate that to things like income inequality measured by the Gini coefficient today. But because we have these lifetime records, we're able to do much more. And we're able to look into account, by using some econometric methods and so forth, what the expected lifetime resources are. So we're able then to say not just what is my income now, but what's my income over the remainder of my life. And then not only what is my income, but what kind of regulatory environment do I face? What kind of uncertainty do I face? What type of credit market do I face? How do I essentially then, how can I then say how much better off these people are? And it isn't like there's a single age at which we can measure this. We can measure it for the parent and for the child. And that's what we do. So without getting into a lot of detail, and I'll skip over a lot of slides because I've run out of time, but I will say one thing that might be very interesting to people here, is that we can actually then compare the welfare of different cohorts of Danes. And this has a lot of economics and economic history embedded into it. Because we know there were substantial welfare reforms in Denmark in the late 80s and early 90s, when the welfare state reached its zenith in some sense. And what we found was a lot of people were on unemployment for long periods of time, that there was a lot of unenrollment or disenrollment in schools and so forth. And so what we can do now is we can construct what are welfare measures, what economists would call value functions, but measures of lifetime utility. And what we can do is compare different cohorts. So this leftmost cohort is the earliest cohort we can really meaningfully discuss. The middle cohort, the dotted line, is the intermediate cohort born in those periods, and then the most recent cohort. And the lower the curve, the higher the value, and the higher the marginal utility, and which is associated with greater welfare. And therefore, what we're seeing is a growth in welfare. And we can chart that. And what we see is that the policies that are affecting social mobility include things like housing. The housing market was greatly reformulated in Denmark. The down payment rates were considerably reduced. Credit constraints were reduced by much lower, not just down payments, but by essentially welfare reforms of the credit system. So things we normally don't think about in terms of education and welfare play actually a very important role. And also, welfare is enhanced because of some of the uncertainty in the economy is reduced. And by giving people more certainty, less variability in the aggregate and the macro, this is a form of welfare increasing, and it also promotes education. So let me just conclude. I will summarize my talk by saying Denmark has a very low inequality, very high social mobility. What we found, though, it's a consequence of tax and transfer policy. It's not a result of all of these very generous daycare, early childhood programs, many of the things that I work on, actually, and I thought I'd find very strong effects. Equality is not a result of those policies. They're very similar outcomes in the US and Denmark, despite universal pre-K, free college, extensive training, and on and on and on. The gaps in skills and so forth are the same for the most educated and less educated parents in both Denmark and the US. Very surprising. But what we do find is strong role of the family influence in sorting, picking neighborhoods, finding peers, and gathering. Maybe that doesn't come as a surprise, but it comes as a surprise to a lot of policies that are saying, give cash, make it all equal, make it fair for everybody. Well, you've got to be very careful when you mean by fair for everybody. You mean fair for people who are in the know, who can take advantage of those policies. And we do think much more richly, more deeply about how we essentially access those policies. Sorting is an intrinsic feature, not only of teachers, but also of parents and students. And this sorting, this notion of groups coming together, there's a book that was written in the US 20 years ago called Coming Apart, showing how more educated people were sort of sorting into certain types of neighborhoods and less educated into others. And the differences were actually growing. I suspect that's true here. I could be wrong. I don't know the statistics. It's certainly true in Denmark. So I think we need to recognize that in creating policies that promote human equality and promote welfare, but not goo naive notions about just handing out cash or thinking that we can make a program that's universal. But we need to really recognize the power of the family and the power of more advantaged families. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I wish you a good evening and a good dinner.